In 1857, the Oregon Territory was still rough country, where gold fever had drawn thousands of hopeful prospectors into the Cascade Mountains. The discovery that would later become known as the Miller-Rogers case occurred near what is now the small town of Blue River in Lane County, approximately 60 miles east of Eugene. It was a region where dense forests met rocky outcroppings, and where the sound of pickaxes against stone echoed through narrow valleys from dawn until dusk. The story begins with what appeared to be a routine mining accident. On September 14th, 1857, a team of prospectors working a claim along the Mackenzie River noticed that their newest member, a quiet man named Henry Rogers, had not returned to camp for 3 consecutive nights. Rogers was known to be methodical in his work, never straying far from the established mining sites, and his absence troubled the other men. When they finally organized a search party, they expected to find him injured somewhere along the familiar trails that connected the various mining claims scattered throughout the valley. What they discovered instead would haunt the region for generations to come. Following a narrow game trail that wound up the mountainside, the search party found Rogers' makeshift campsite abandoned, his tools scattered as if he had left in great haste. More disturbing was the discovery of a woman's leather boot, partially buried under a pile of loose stones, approximately 200 yards from Rogers' camp. The boot was small, well-made, and clearly not designed for the harsh conditions of mountain prospecting. The search party, led by an experienced miner named Thomas Sullivan, decided to expand their investigation. Using the boot as a starting point, they began a systematic search of the surrounding area. It was Sullivan who first noticed the irregularity in the landscape that would lead to the most significant discovery. Behind a stand of Douglas fir trees, partially concealed by decades of fallen branches and undergrowth, was what appeared to be the remains of a crude dwelling. The structure was more substantial than the typical prospector's lean-to, suggesting it had been intended for longer-term habitation. As the men cleared away the debris, they uncovered the remnants of what had once been a small cabin. The roof had long since collapsed, and the walls showed evidence of hasty construction. More importantly, they found personal effects scattered throughout the ruins: fragments of women's clothing, a broken mirror, and several pieces of jewelry that were far too fine for frontier living. Among these items was a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a young woman with dark hair and pale skin. The portrait was signed on the reverse with the initials J.M. and dated 1856. The discovery of the cabin raised immediate questions about Rogers' disappearance and his possible connection to the mysterious woman whose belongings littered the site. Sullivan's group decided to conduct a more thorough search of the area, focusing on the ground immediately surrounding the collapsed structure. It was during this search that they made the discovery that would transform a simple missing person case into something far more sinister. Beneath what appeared to be a deliberately placed pile of stones, the searchers found the skeletal remains of a young woman. The skeleton was positioned in an unnatural manner, curled on its side as if the woman had died in great distress. Most notably, the bones of her right hand were wrapped around a simple gold wedding band, which she appeared to have been clutching at the time of her death. The ring bore an inscription that was still partially legible: H.R. to J.M., 1856. The initials matched both the locket found in the cabin ruins and, more significantly, the name Henry Rogers, who remained missing. The wedding ring suggested a relationship between Rogers and the deceased woman that none of his fellow miners had known about. This revelation cast Rogers' disappearance in an entirely different light, transforming him from a victim of circumstance into a person of significant interest in what appeared to be a far more complex situation. Thomas Sullivan, recognizing the gravity of the discovery, decided to halt the search and report their findings to the territorial authorities. However, the nearest law enforcement was more than a day's ride away, and the mining camp was effectively isolated from any formal legal structure. The men faced a difficult decision about how to proceed with both the remains they had discovered and the ongoing search for Rogers, who might have answers to the questions that were multiplying with each new piece of evidence. The woman's skeleton was carefully examined by Dr. Marcus Webb, a former army surgeon who had taken up mining after leaving military service. Webb's medical background, though not specifically related to forensic examination, provided the only expert opinion available in the remote location. His preliminary assessment suggested the woman had been dead for approximately 1 year, placing her death sometime in 1856, which coincided with the date inscribed on both the wedding ring and the locket. More troubling was Webb's observation that several of the woman's ribs showed signs of having been broken, though he could not determine whether these injuries had occurred before or after death. Webb's examination also revealed that the woman had likely been young, probably no more than 25 years of age, and had shown evidence of having lived a comfortable life before whatever circumstances brought her to the remote mountain location. Her teeth were in good condition, suggesting adequate nutrition and care, and the bones showed no signs of the malnutrition or disease that often affected frontier women. This evidence painted a picture of someone who had not chosen the harsh mountain existence voluntarily, raising further questions about her relationship with Rogers and the circumstances that had led to her presence in such an isolated location. The investigation took another disturbing turn when the miners discovered a cache of letters buried beneath the cabin's collapsed floorboards. The letters, wrapped in oiled cloth and remarkably well preserved, consisted of correspondence between Jane Miller and her family in Portland, dating from the spring and summer of 1856. The letters revealed that Jane had recently married a man named Henry Rogers, whom she described as a successful businessman with interests in both mining and timber. According to her correspondence, Rogers had convinced her to accompany him to a new mining claim, where they would establish their home and build their fortune together. Jane's letters to her family, however, showed a progressive change in tone as the months passed. Her early correspondence was filled with excitement about her new marriage and optimism about their future prospects. By late summer, her letters had become shorter and less frequent, mentioning difficulties with their isolation and Rogers' increasingly erratic behavior. Her final letter, dated August 23, 1856, expressed concern about Rogers' treatment of her and mentioned her desire to return to Portland, though she feared Rogers would not permit her to leave. The correspondence painted a picture of a relationship that had deteriorated rapidly, with Jane Miller apparently becoming a prisoner in the remote mountain location. Her final letter mentioned hearing sounds at night that frightened her and suggested that Rogers had become violent when she attempted to discuss returning to civilization. Most significantly, she wrote that she had hidden the letter in hopes that someone would eventually find it and understand what had happened to her if she did not survive. Dr. Webb's continued examination of the skeletal remains, aided by the information from the letters, led to additional disturbing discoveries. The positioning of the skeleton suggested that Jane Miller had not simply died of natural causes or accident. The way her arms were positioned and the fact that she was found clutching the wedding ring indicated that she had been conscious and aware during her final moments. Webb theorized that she had removed the ring from her finger deliberately, possibly as a final act of rejection of her marriage to Rogers, or as evidence of his identity for anyone who might later discover her remains. The search for Rogers continued, but took on a new urgency as evidence mounted that he was responsible for his wife's death. The mining camp was small, and word of the discoveries spread quickly among the prospectors working throughout the valley. Several men came forward with information about Rogers' behavior during his brief time at the camp. They described him as secretive and prone to violent outbursts, particularly when drinking. More significantly, one miner reported that Rogers had mentioned having a wife, but claimed she had died of fever during their journey west. This information contradicted the timeline established by the letters and raised questions about whether Rogers had planned Jane's death from the beginning, or whether the situation had developed over time. The letters suggested that Jane had been alive as late as August 1856, but Rogers' comments to his fellow miners implied that he had been telling people she was dead for some time before that date. This discrepancy suggested a level of premeditation that made Rogers' current disappearance even more suspicious. The investigation expanded to include a search of Rogers' personal belongings, which had been left behind when he disappeared. Among his possessions, the miners found several items that had clearly belonged to a woman: a tortoise-shell hair comb, a small silver thimble, and a leather-bound book of poetry inscribed "To Jane, with all my love, Mother, 1855. These items contradicted Rogers' claims about his wife's death and provided additional evidence of Jane Miller's presence at the mining camp. More disturbing was the discovery of a journal that Rogers had apparently been keeping since his arrival at the camp. The journal entries revealed a man struggling with guilt and paranoia, constantly looking over his shoulder and expecting to be discovered. One entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, read, "The others are beginning to ask questions. I see the way they look at me when they think I am not watching. Perhaps it is time to move on again, but where can a man go when his sins follow him like shadows?" The journal entries provided insight into Rogers' state of mind, but offered few concrete details about what had happened to Jane Miller. However, they did reveal that Rogers had moved frequently before arriving at the Oregon mining camp, suggesting that he had been running from something, possibly other crimes. The entries also indicated that he had been having nightmares and hearing sounds that he attributed to his guilty conscience, though he never explicitly confessed to any wrongdoing in the written pages. As autumn progressed, the search for Rogers expanded beyond the immediate area of the mining camp. Territorial authorities had finally been notified of the situation, and a formal investigation was launched under the direction of Deputy Marshal William Harrison. Harrison arrived at the camp in early October with additional men and resources, transforming the informal search into an official manhunt. His investigation would uncover additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of Henry Rogers and his relationship with Jane Miller. Harrison's team conducted a more systematic search of the cabin ruins and surrounding area, using techniques that the miners had not been equipped to employ. This expanded search revealed additional evidence of violence and concealment. Beneath the cabin's foundation, investigators found fragments of clothing that had been deliberately burned, along with personal items that appeared to have been hastily buried. Most significantly, they discovered a second cache of letters, these written by Jane Miller but never sent, hidden in a crevice in the rock wall behind the cabin. These unsent letters revealed the full extent of Jane's desperation and fear during her final weeks. Unlike the correspondence she had managed to send to her family, these letters contained explicit descriptions of Rogers' violence and her growing certainty that he intended to kill her. One letter, apparently written just days before her death, described Rogers' threats to kill her if she attempted to leave or if she contacted anyone about their situation. She wrote that she had begun hiding food and supplies in preparation for an escape attempt, but feared that Rogers was watching her too closely for her to succeed. The unsent letters also provided details about the gradual deterioration of Rogers' mental state during their time in the mountains. Jane described him as becoming increasingly paranoid and violent, accusing her of planning to betray him to the authorities. She wrote that he had begun talking about others who were pursuing him, though she never understood what crimes he might have committed before their marriage. Most chilling was her description of Rogers' threats to ensure that she would never leave the mountain alive if she persisted in her attempts to contact her family or return to Portland. The investigation took another significant turn when Deputy Marshal Harrison received word from authorities in Portland about Jane Miller's background and her marriage to Rogers. According to records in Portland, Jane Miller had been the daughter of a prosperous merchant family, and her sudden marriage to Rogers had surprised those who knew her. More importantly, Portland authorities revealed that they had been investigating Rogers in connection with the suspicious death of another woman, his first wife, who had died under questionable circumstances in California before Rogers moved to Oregon. This information suggested that Jane Miller had been the victim of a man with a history of violence against women, and that her death might not have been an isolated incident. Harrison dispatched messages to California authorities requesting information about Rogers' first wife and any other crimes he might have committed. The response, which arrived several weeks later, confirmed their worst fears. Rogers had been wanted in connection with 3 separate incidents involving the deaths or disappearances of women he had been romantically involved with, dating back to 1853. The pattern that emerged from these investigations painted a picture of a serial predator who had been moving from place to place, assuming new identities and targeting vulnerable women. In each case, Rogers had presented himself as a successful businessman with promising prospects, convincing his victims to accompany him to remote locations where they would be isolated and vulnerable. The discovery of Jane Miller's remains appeared to be the culmination of a criminal career that had spanned multiple states and territories. As winter approached, the search for Rogers intensified, but the trail had gone cold. Despite expanded searches of the surrounding mountain areas and inquiries at settlements throughout Oregon Territory, no trace of Rogers could be found. Some investigators theorized that he had fled to California, or perhaps even further west, while others believed he might have died in the wilderness, either by accident or by his own hand. The harsh mountain winter made continued searching impossible, and the case was effectively suspended until spring. The story of Jane Miller's death and Rogers' disappearance became part of local folklore, but the case remained officially open. Over the following months, occasional reports surfaced of sightings of a man matching Rogers' description in various locations throughout the Pacific Northwest, but none of these reports could be confirmed. The mining camp where the discoveries had been made was eventually abandoned, as the easily accessible gold was exhausted, and the cabin ruins where Jane had died were reclaimed by the forest. In 1858, nearly a year after the discovery of Jane Miller's remains, a traveling minister named Reverend Samuel Morrison reported an encounter that briefly reignited interest in the Rogers case. Morrison claimed that while traveling through a remote area of southern Oregon, he had met a man living as a hermit who matched Rogers' description and who had confessed to killing his wife in the mountains. According to Morrison, the man had been living in complete isolation, apparently driven to madness by guilt and paranoia. Morrison's report led to another search effort, but when authorities reached the location he had described, they found only the remains of a primitive shelter and evidence that someone had been living there for an extended period. However, whoever had been at the site had departed before the search party arrived, leaving behind few clues about their identity. Among the items left behind was a wedding ring that appeared similar to the one found clutched in Jane Miller's skeletal hand, but without additional evidence, investigators could not definitively link the site to Rogers. The Morrison incident marked the last significant development in the Rogers case. Over the following years, occasional reports continued to surface of sightings or encounters with men who might have been Rogers, but none could be substantiated. The case gradually faded from active investigation, though it remained in the files of territorial law enforcement as an unsolved murder. Jane Miller was buried in the Portland Cemetery, where her family had a plot, and her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers faced by women in the frontier territories. The discovery site itself took on a reputation that persisted long after the original miners had moved on to other claims. Local Native American tribes had long considered the area to be unlucky, and the events of 1857 seemed to confirm their beliefs. Subsequent attempts to work mining claims in the immediate vicinity were unsuccessful, with prospectors reporting equipment failures, accidents, and a general sense of unease that drove them to seek opportunities elsewhere. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had conducted the examination of Jane Miller's remains, continued to practice medicine in the Oregon Territory for several years after the incident. In his later writings, he reflected on the case as an example of the lawlessness and violence that characterized frontier life, particularly for women who found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Webb noted that Jane Miller's death represented not just an individual tragedy, but a symptom of broader social problems that would continue to plague frontier communities until more stable legal and social institutions could be established. The letters that had been discovered during the investigation were eventually turned over to Jane Miller's family in Portland, providing them with some closure about their daughter's fate, though the pain of her loss remained with them for the rest of their lives. Jane's mother, Margaret Miller, used the letters as the basis for a campaign to raise awareness about the dangers faced by women in frontier territories, particularly the risks associated with hasty marriages to men with unknown backgrounds. Thomas Sullivan, who had led the original search party that discovered Jane Miller's remains, left mining soon after the incident and returned to his family in the Midwest. In letters to friends, he wrote that the events in the mountains had changed his perspective on the pursuit of gold and the price that people were willing to pay for the promise of wealth. Sullivan noted that the discovery had reminded him that some things were far more valuable than gold, and that the isolation and lawlessness of frontier life could bring out the worst aspects of human nature. The case also had broader implications for law enforcement in the Oregon Territory. The difficulties encountered in investigating Jane Miller's death and pursuing Rogers highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between different jurisdictions, as well as the importance of maintaining accurate records that could help identify criminals who moved from place to place. Deputy Marshal Harrison used the case as an example in his reports to territorial authorities, arguing for increased resources and improved procedures for handling similar incidents. In 1862, 5 years after Jane Miller's death, a final chapter was added to the story when construction workers building a railroad line through the Cascade Mountains discovered additional human remains in a remote canyon approximately 20 miles from the original mining camp. The remains were those of a middle-aged man, and among the personal effects found with the body was a leather wallet containing identification papers bearing the name Henry Rogers. The wallet also contained a confession letter, apparently written by Rogers shortly before his death, in which he admitted to killing Jane Miller and described the guilt and paranoia that had driven him to flee into the wilderness. According to the letter, Rogers had spent months living rough in the mountains, gradually losing his sanity as he struggled with the weight of his crimes. The letter provided details about Jane's death that had not been previously known, including Rogers' claim that he had killed her during a violent argument when she threatened to expose his criminal past to the authorities. Rogers' confession letter also revealed additional information about his criminal history, including admissions to the murders of 2 other women in California and Nevada territory. The letter described a pattern of behavior in which Rogers would target women from respectable families, convince them to marry him, and then kill them when they became inconvenient or threatened to expose his true nature. Rogers claimed in the letter that he had never intended to become a killer, but that circumstances had forced him into increasingly violent acts as he tried to escape the consequences of his earlier crimes. The discovery of Rogers' remains provided some measure of closure to the Jane Miller case, though it raised new questions about the full extent of his criminal activities. Authorities in California and Nevada were notified of the confession, and investigations were launched into the cases Rogers had mentioned in his letter. These investigations confirmed that Rogers had indeed been responsible for multiple murders across the Western Territories, making him one of the most prolific serial killers of the frontier period. The confession letter also provided insight into Rogers' psychological state during his final months. He described being haunted by visions of his victims and claimed that he could hear Jane Miller calling to him from the grave. The letter suggested that Rogers had been driven to the brink of madness by guilt and fear, and that his death in the remote canyon had been either suicide or the result of his inability to care for himself while living as a fugitive. Medical examination of Rogers' remains suggested that he had died sometime in late 1858 or early 1859, meaning that he had survived in the wilderness for more than a year after fleeing the mining camp. The harsh conditions and isolation had clearly taken their toll, and physical evidence suggested that Rogers had suffered from malnutrition and exposure during his final months. The location where his body was found was particularly remote, suggesting that he had been actively avoiding contact with civilization even at the cost of his own survival. The discovery of Rogers' confession brought the Jane Miller case to an official close, but the story continued to resonate throughout the Oregon Territory and beyond. The case became a subject of newspaper coverage and popular discussion, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier life and the importance of careful investigation when people disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The story was particularly significant for women's rights advocates, who used Jane Miller's fate as an example of the vulnerabilities faced by women in a society with limited legal protections. Local historians later noted that the Miller-Rogers case represented a turning point in law enforcement practices in the Oregon Territory. The difficulties encountered in investigating the case led to reforms in how missing person reports were handled and how information was shared between different jurisdictions. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records and establishing better communication networks to track criminals who moved frequently between different territories and states. The site where Jane Miller's remains were discovered eventually became part of the Willamette National Forest, and the location is now marked by a small memorial stone placed by local historical societies. The memorial identifies the site as the place where Jane Miller died and serves as a reminder of the violence and tragedy that characterized much of frontier life. Visitors to the area often report a sense of sadness and unease, though whether this reflects the actual events that occurred there or simply the power of the story itself remains a matter of speculation. Dr. Webb's medical notes from his examination of Jane Miller's remains were eventually donated to the Oregon Historical Society, where they remain part of the permanent collection documenting frontier life and early law enforcement practices. The notes provide valuable insight into the challenges faced by medical professionals operating with limited resources and training in remote locations, as well as the difficulties of conducting forensic examinations under primitive conditions. The letters that Jane Miller wrote to her family, both those that were sent and those that were discovered after her death, were also preserved by the Oregon Historical Society and have been used by researchers studying women's experiences on the frontier. The letters provide a rare first-hand account of domestic violence and isolation in frontier communities, offering insights into the psychological and emotional challenges faced by women who found themselves trapped in dangerous situations with limited options for escape or assistance. Modern forensic experts who have reviewed the historical records of the Miller-Rogers case have noted several aspects of the investigation that were remarkably sophisticated for the time period. The systematic search of the area around the cabin, the careful preservation of evidence, and the detailed documentation of the findings all demonstrated a level of professionalism that was unusual for frontier law enforcement. These practices likely contributed to the eventual resolution of the case and served as a model for similar investigations in other territories. The story of Jane Miller and Henry Rogers has also attracted the attention of criminal psychologists studying the historical development of serial killing patterns in American society. Rogers' behavior, as documented in the various investigations and his own confession, displays many characteristics that are now recognized as typical of serial killers, including the targeting of vulnerable victims, the use of deception to gain their trust, and the pattern of escalating violence over time. Some researchers have suggested that the frontier environment, with its isolation, limited law enforcement, and transient population, may have provided ideal conditions for serial predators like Rogers to operate without detection for extended periods. The lack of communication between different jurisdictions and the limited record-keeping practices of the time made it difficult to identify patterns of criminal behavior that crossed territorial boundaries. The psychological profile of Rogers that emerges from the historical record shows a man who was able to present a facade of respectability while concealing a capacity for extreme violence. His ability to convince multiple women to trust him and follow him to remote locations suggests considerable skill at manipulation and deception. The progression from his first known crime to his final confession also shows the typical escalation pattern seen in many serial killers, with each crime making the next one easier to commit. The impact of the Miller-Rogers case extended beyond its immediate legal and social implications. The story became part of the oral tradition of the Pacific Northwest, passed down through generations of families who had lived in the region during the frontier period. These oral accounts, while not always historically accurate, preserved the essential elements of the story and helped to maintain awareness of the dangers that had faced early settlers, particularly women traveling to remote areas with men they did not know well. Local folklore surrounding the case also developed several variations and embellishments over time. Some versions of the story claimed that Jane Miller's spirit continued to haunt the area where she died, protecting other women who might find themselves in similar danger. Other variations suggested that Rogers had been cursed by Jane Miller before her death, leading to his eventual downfall and death in the wilderness. While these supernatural elements were not part of the official investigation, they reflected the deep emotional impact that the case had on the local community. The Miller-Rogers case also influenced the development of missing person procedures in other Western territories and states. News of the investigation and its eventual resolution spread through law enforcement networks, providing a template for how similar cases might be handled. The importance of systematic searching, careful evidence preservation, and coordination between different jurisdictions became recognized as essential elements of effective criminal investigation. Educational institutions that developed in the Oregon Territory in subsequent decades often use the Miller-Rogers case as an example in courses dealing with law, medicine, and social issues. The case provided a real-world illustration of the challenges faced by frontier communities and the importance of developing strong institutions to protect vulnerable members of society. Law students, In particular, studied the case as an example of how criminal investigations should be conducted and how evidence should be gathered and preserved. The medical aspects of the case also provided valuable learning opportunities for future doctors and medical students. Dr. Webb's examination of Jane Miller's remains, while limited by the technology and knowledge available at the time, demonstrated the importance of careful observation and documentation in forensic medicine. The detailed notes he kept during his examination provided a foundation for understanding how medical evidence could be used in criminal investigations. The preservation of evidence from the Miller-Rogers case has continued to provide insights for modern researchers and investigators. In the 1960s, when new forensic techniques became available, some of the preserved materials from the case were re-examined using more advanced methods. While these modern examinations did not change the fundamental conclusions about what had happened to Jane Miller, they did provide additional confirmation of the original findings and demonstrated the accuracy of the frontier-era investigation. Contemporary discussions of the Miller-Rogers case often focus on its relevance to modern understanding of domestic violence and serial crime. Jane Miller's situation, trapped in an isolated location with an increasingly violent husband and no access to help or support, mirrors the experiences of many modern victims of domestic violence. The case illustrates how isolation and economic dependence can be used as tools of control and abuse, themes that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of violence against women. The investigative techniques used in the Miller-Rogers case also demonstrate early applications of methods that would later become standard in criminal investigations. The systematic search of the crime scene, the careful documentation of evidence, and the integration of multiple sources of information all represent approaches that are still used by modern law enforcement. And though with more sophisticated tools and techniques, as the Oregon Territory evolved into statehood and developed more sophisticated legal and social institutions, the Miller-Rogers case came to be seen as representing a transitional period in the region's history. The case illustrated both the dangers and lawlessness of frontier life and the beginnings of more effective responses to criminal behavior. The eventual resolution of the case, despite the challenges posed by the remote location and limited resources, demonstrated that even frontier communities could successfully investigate and solve serious crimes when proper procedures were followed. And so, more than a century after Jane Miller clutched that wedding ring in her final moments, her story continues to resonate as a reminder of the price that was sometimes paid during the settlement of the American West. The ring that she held so tightly, perhaps as a final act of defiance or a desperate hope that someone would understand what had happened to her, became the key piece of evidence that ultimately led to the truth about her death and the man who killed her. In the end, despite Rogers' attempts to hide his crimes in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, justice found its way to the truth, though it came too late to save Jane Miller herself. Today, the forests where these events occurred continue to grow over the sites where Jane Miller lived her final days and where Henry Rogers met his own end. The sounds of the mountain wilderness have returned, no longer interrupted by the ring of pickaxes or the voices of prospectors. But somewhere in those hills, marked now only by time and memory, lies the story of a young woman whose courage in her final moments helped ensure that her killer would not escape unpunished, and whose death became a catalyst for changes that would make the frontier a safer place for those who came after her. The legacy of Jane Miller's case extends beyond the immediate tragedy of her death. In 1864, the Oregon State Legislature passed what became known as the Miller Act, requiring territorial authorities to maintain detailed records of missing persons and establishing protocols for interjurisdictional cooperation in criminal investigations. The legislation was directly influenced by the difficulties encountered in tracking Henry Rogers across multiple territories. Jane Miller's family in Portland used their daughter's story to advocate for women's rights and safety measures in frontier communities. Margaret Miller, Jane's mother, established a network of boarding houses and safe havens for women traveling alone in the Oregon Territory, ensuring that future travelers would have alternatives to relying solely on the protection of men they barely knew. The mining camp where the tragedy began was eventually abandoned, but not before the miners erected a simple wooden cross marking the spot where Jane Miller's remains had been discovered. The cross bore only her initials and the year of her death, but it served as a reminder to anyone who might pass through the area of the human cost of the gold rush era. Dr. Webb continued his medical practice until 1871, when he returned to the East Coast to teach at a medical college. In his memoirs, published posthumously in 1885, he wrote extensively about the Miller case and its impact on his understanding of frontier justice. His detailed documentation of the case became a standard reference for early forensic medicine in American law enforcement. Deputy Marshal Harrison went on to become one of Oregon's first state sheriffs, using the investigative techniques developed during the Miller case as the foundation for more systematic approaches to criminal investigation. The protocols he established were adopted throughout the Pacific Northwest and influenced law enforcement practices well into the 20th century. The confession letter left by Henry Rogers was eventually published in legal journals as an early example of criminal psychology documentation. Modern profilers who have studied the letter note its detailed self-analysis and the clear progression of psychological deterioration that led to Rogers' final breakdown in the wilderness. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Jane Miller became a cautionary tale that was told throughout frontier communities, serving as a warning about the importance of maintaining contact with family and community even in remote areas. The letters she had managed to send to her family and the unsent letters discovered after her death demonstrated the crucial importance of communication in preventing isolation and abuse. In 1967, exactly 110 years after Jane Miller's death, the Oregon Historical Society organized an expedition to locate and document the sites connected to the case. Using historical records and geographical surveys, they successfully identified the location where the cabin ruins had been found and erected a permanent memorial stone. The memorial reads simply, Jane Miller, 1832 to 1856. Her courage in darkness brought light to justice. Today, hikers occasionally visit the memorial site, though access requires a challenging trek through dense forest terrain. Park rangers report that visitors often leave small tokens of remembrance, flowers, stones arranged in patterns, or simple notes acknowledging Jane Miller's story. The site has become an informal shrine to the countless unnamed victims of frontier violence. The wedding ring that Jane Miller clutched in her final moments was eventually returned to her family in Portland, where it was preserved as part of the family's private collection. In 1923, Jane's grandniece donated the ring to the Oregon Historical Society, where it remains on permanent display as part of an exhibit on women's experiences during the territorial period. The ring itself bears the simple inscription that first connected Henry Rogers to the crime, H.R. to J.M., 1856. No, museum visitors often note the irony that the symbol of Rogers's supposed love and commitment became the evidence that ensured his identification as a killer. The ring serves as a powerful reminder that the most intimate relationships can sometimes conceal the greatest dangers. Recent archaeological surveys of the area have used ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques to search for additional evidence related to the case. While no significant new discoveries have been made, The surveys have confirmed the accuracy of the original investigators' work and provided additional details about the construction and layout of the cabin where Jane Miller spent her final months. Climate change and forest management practices have altered the landscape significantly since 1857, but the essential geography remains recognizable from historical descriptions. The Mackenzie River still follows its ancient course, and the Douglas fir forests continue to dominate the mountain slopes where these events unfolded more than a century and a half ago. The Miller-Rogers case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented criminal investigations of the Oregon Territorial period. The combination of physical evidence, written records, and detailed testimony created an unusually complete picture of both the crime and its resolution. This documentation has made the case valuable, not only as historical record, but as an early example of systematic criminal investigation techniques. Educational programs throughout the Pacific Northwest continue to use the Jane Miller story as a case study in multiple disciplines. Law enforcement academies examine the investigative procedures. Women's studies programs analyze the social dynamics that made Jane vulnerable, and history courses use the case to illustrate broader themes about frontier life and territorial development. The story reminds us that behind every historical statistic about frontier violence were real people whose lives were cut short by circumstances beyond their control. Jane Miller's courage in her final days, documented through her letters and the evidence she left behind, ensured that her death would not be forgotten and that her killer would ultimately face justice, even if that justice came too late to save her life. And so the mountains of Oregon keep their secrets still, but among the tall trees and rushing waters, the memory of Jane Miller endures as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in its darkest hour, and as a reminder that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence can speak the loudest truths about the past.